This audiobook is made by RealmofAudiobook.
The Rainbow by D.H. Lawrence. The Rainbow: How Tom Brangwen Married a Polish Lady. The Brangwens had lived for generations on the Marsh farm, in the meadows where the Arawash twisted sluggishly through alder trees, separating Derbyshire from Nottinghamshire. 2 miles away, a church tower stood on a hill, the houses of the little country town climbing assiduously up to it. Whenever one of the Brangwens in the fields lifted his head from his work, he saw the church tower at Ilkeston in the empty sky. So that as he turned again to the horizontal land, he was aware of something standing above him and beyond him in the distance. There was a look in the eyes of the Brangwens as if they were expecting something unknown, about which they were eager. They had that air of readiness for what would come to them, a kind of surety, an expectancy, the look of an inheritor. They were fresh, blonde, slow-speaking people, revealing themselves plainly but slowly, so that one could watch the change in their eyes from laughter to anger, blue, lit-up laughter, to a hard blue staring anger, through all the irresolute stages of the sky when the weather is changing. Living on rich land, on their own land, near to a growing town, they had forgotten what it was to be in straitened circumstances. They had never become rich, because there were always children, and the patrimony was divided every time. But always at the marsh there was ample. So the Brangwens came and went without fear of necessity, working hard because of the life that was in them, not for want of the money. Neither were they thriftless. They were aware of the last halfpenny, and instinct made them not waste the peeling of their apple, for it would help to feed the cattle. But heaven and earth was teeming around them, and how should this cease? They felt the rush of the sap in spring. They knew the wave which cannot halt, but every year throws forward the seed to begetting, and, falling back, leaves the young-born on the earth. They knew the intercourse between heaven and earth, sunshine drawn into the breast and bowels, the rain sucked up in the daytime, nakedness that comes under the wind in autumn, showing the birds nests no longer worth hiding. Their life and interrelations were such, feeling the pulse and body of the soil, that opened to their furrow for the grain, and became smooth and supple after their plowing, and clung to their feet with a weight that pulled like desire, lying hard and unresponsive when the crops were to be shorn away. The young corn waved and was silken, and the luster slid along the limbs of the men who saw it. They took the udder of the cows. The cows yielded milk and pulse against the hands of the men. The pulse of the blood of the teats of the cows beat into the pulse of the hands of the men. They mounted their horses, and held life between the grip of their knees. They harnessed their horses at the wagon, and, with hand on the bridle rings, drew the heaving of the horses after their will. In autumn the partridges whirred up, birds in flocks blew like spray across the fallow, rooks appeared on the gray, watery heavens, and flew cawing into the winter. Then the men sat by the fire in the house where the women moved about with surety, and the limbs and the body of the men were impregnated with the day, cattle and earth and vegetation and the sky. The men sat by the fire, and their brains were inert, as their blood flowed heavy with the accumulation from the living day. The women were different. On them too was the drowse of blood intimacy, calves sucking and hens running together in droves, and young geese palpitating in the hand while the food was pushed down their throttle. But the women looked out from the heated, blind intercourse of farm life to the spoken world beyond. They were aware of the lips and the mind of the world speaking and giving utterance. They heard the sound in the distance, and they strained to listen. It was enough for the men that the earth heaved and opened its furrow to them, that the wind blew to dry the wet wheat, and set the young ears of corn wheeling freshly round about. It was enough that they helped the cow in labor, or ferreted the rats from under the barn, or broke the back of a rabbit with a sharp knock of the hand. So much warmth and generating and pain and death did they know in their blood, earth and sky and beast and green plants. So much exchange and interchange they had with these, that they lived full and surcharged, their senses full fed, their faces always turned to the heat of the blood, staring into the sun, dazed with looking towards the source of generation, unable to turn round. But the woman wanted another form of life than this, something that was not blood intimacy. Her house faced out from the farm buildings and fields, looked out to the road, and the village with church and hall, and the world beyond. She stood to see the far-off world of cities and governments and the active scope of man, the magic land to her, where secrets were made known and desires fulfilled. She faced outwards to where men moved dominant and creative, having turned their back on the pulsing heat of creation, and with this behind them, were set out to discover what was beyond, to enlarge their own scope and range and freedom, whereas the Brangwen men faced inwards to the teeming life of creation, which poured unresolved into their veins. Looking out, as she must, from the front of her house towards the activity of man in the world at large, whilst her husband looked out to the back at sky and harvest and beast and land, she strained her eyes to see what man had done in fighting outwards to knowledge. She strained to hear how he uttered himself in his conquest. Her deepest desire hung on the battle that she heard, far off, being waged on the edge of the unknown. She also wanted to know, and to be of the fighting host. At home, even so near as Kosathe, was the vicar, who spoke the other, magic language, and had the other, finer bearing, both of which she could perceive, but could never attain to. The vicar moved in worlds beyond where her own menfolk existed. Did she not know her own menfolk? Fresh, slow, full-built men, masterful enough, but easy, native to the earth, lacking outwardness and range of motion. Whereas the vicar, dark and dry and small beside her husband, had yet a quickness and a range of being that made Brangwen, in his large geniality, seem dull and local. She knew her husband, but in the vicar's nature was that which passed beyond her knowledge. As Brangwen had power over the cattle, so the vicar had power over her husband. What was it in the vicar that raised him above the common men as man is raised above the beast? She craved to know. She craved to achieve this higher being, if not in herself, then in her children. That which makes a man strong even if he be little and frail in body, just as any man is little and frail beside a bull, and yet stronger than the bull, what was it? It was not money nor power nor position. What power had the vicar over Tom Brangwen? None. Yet stripped them and set them on a desert island, and the vicar was the master. His soul was master of the other man's. And why? She decided it was a question of knowledge. The curate was poor enough, and not very efficacious as a man, either. Yet he took rank with those others, the superior. She watched his children being born. She saw them running as tiny things beside their mother. And already they were separate from her own children, distinct. Why were her own children marked below the others? Why should the curate's children inevitably take precedence over her children? Why should dominance be given them from the start? It was not money nor even class. It was education and experience, she decided. It was this education, this higher form of being, that the mother wished to give to her children so that they too could live the supreme life on earth. For her children, at least the children of her heart, had the complete nature that should take place in equality with the living, vital people in the land, not be left behind obscure among the laborers. Why must they remain obscured and stifled all their lives? Why should they suffer from lack of freedom to move? How should they learn the entry into the finer, more vivid circle of life? Her imagination was fired by the squire's lady at Shelley Hall, who came to church at Kosathe with her little children, girls in tidy capes of beaver fur and smart little hats, herself like a winter rose, so fair and delicate, so fair, so fine in mold, so luminous. What was it that Mrs. Hardy felt which she, Mrs. Brangwen, did not feel? How was Mrs. Hardy's nature different from that of the common women of Kosathe, and what was it beyond them? All the women of Kosathe talked eagerly about Mrs. Hardy, of her husband, her children, her guests, her dress, of her servants, and her housekeeping. The lady of the hall was the living dream of their lives. Her life was the epic that inspired their lives. In her they lived imaginatively, and in gossiping of her husband who drank, of her scandalous brother, of Lord William Bentley her friend, Member of Parliament for the division, they had their own Odyssey enacting itself, Penelope and Ulysses before them, and Circe and the swine and the endless web. So the women of the village were fortunate. They saw themselves in the lady of the manor, Each of them lived her own fulfillment of the life of Mrs. Hardy. And the Brangwen wife of the marsh aspired beyond herself, towards the further life of the finer woman, towards the extended being she revealed, as a traveler in his self-contained manner reveals far-off countries present in himself. But why should a knowledge of far-off countries make a man's life a different thing, finer, bigger? And why is a man more than the beast and the cattle that serve him? It is the same thing. The male part of the poem was filled in by such men as the Vicar and Lord William, lean, eager men with strange movements, men who had command of the further fields, whose lives ranged over a great extent. It was something very desirable to know, this touch of the wonderful men who had the power of thought and comprehension. The women of the village might be much fonder of Tom Brangwen and more at their ease with him, yet if their lives had been robbed of the Vicar and of Lord William, the leading shoot would have been cut away from them. They would have been heavy and uninspired and inclined to hate. So long as the wonder of the beyond was before them, they could get along, whatever their lot. And Mrs. Hardy and the Vicar and Lord William, these moved in the wonder of the beyond, and were visible to the eyes of Kossuth in their motion.
2.
About 1840, a canal was constructed across the meadows of the Marsh Farm, connecting the newly opened collieries of the Arawash Valley. A high embankment traveled along the fields to carry the canal, which passed close to the homestead and, reaching the road, went over in a heavy bridge. So the marsh was shut off from Ilkeston and enclosed in the small valley bed, which ended in a bushy hill and the village spire of Kossuth. The Brangwens received a fair sum of money from this trespass across their land. Then, a short time afterwards, a colliery was sunk on the other side of the canal, and in a while the Midland Railway came down the valley at the foot of the Ilkeston Hill, and the invasion was complete. The town grew rapidly. The Brangwens were kept busy producing supplies. They became richer. They were almost tradesmen. Still the marsh remained remote and original, on the old, quiet side of the canal embankment, in the sunny valley where slow water wound along in company of stiff alders, and the road went under ash trees past the Brangwens' garden gate. But, looking from the garden gate down the road to the right, there, through the dark archway of the canal's square aqueduct, was a colliery spinning away in the near distance, and further, red, crude houses plastered on the valley in masses, and beyond all, the dim smoking hill of the town. The homestead was just on the safe side of civilization, outside the gate. The house stood bare from the road, approached by a straight garden path, along which at spring the daffodils were thick in green and yellow. At the sides of the house were bushes of lilac and guelder rose and privet, entirely hiding the farm buildings behind. At the back a confusion of sheds spread into the home close from out of 2 or 3 indistinct yards. The duck pond lay beyond the furthest wall, littering its white feathers on the padded earthen banks, blowing its stray soiled feathers into the grass and the gorse bushes below the canal embankment, which rose like a high rampart near at hand, so that occasionally a man's figure passed in silhouette, or a man and a towing horse traversed the sky. At first the Brangwens were astonished by all this commotion around them. The building of a canal across their land made them strangers in their own place. This raw bank of earth shutting them off disconcerted them. As they worked in the fields, from beyond the now familiar embankment came the rhythmic run of the winding engines, startling at first, but afterwards a narcotic to the brain. Then the shrill whistle of the trains re-echoed through the heart, with fearsome pleasure, announcing the far-off come near and imminent. As they drove home from town, the farmers of the land met the blackened colliers trooping from the pit-mouth. As they gathered the harvest, the west wind brought a faint, sulphurous smell of pit refuse burning. As they pulled the turnips in November, the sharp clink, 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 clink of empty trucks shunting on the line vibrated in their hearts with the fact of other activity going on beyond them. The Alfred Brangwen of this period had married a woman from Heanor, a daughter of the Black Horse. She was a slim, pretty, dark woman, quaint in her speech, whimsical so that the sharp things she said did not hurt. She was oddly a thing to herself, rather querulous in her manner, but intrinsically separate and indifferent, so that her long lamentable complaints, when she raised her voice against her husband in particular and against everybody else after him, only made those who heard her wonder and feel affectionately towards her, even while they were irritated and impatient with her. She railed long and loud about her husband, but always with a balanced, easy-flying voice and a quaint manner of speech that warmed his belly with pride and male triumph while he scowled with mortification at the things she said. Consequently, Brangwen himself had a humorous puckering at the eyes, a sort of fat laugh, very quiet and full, and he was spoilt like a lord of creation. He calmly did as he liked, laughed at their railing, excused himself in a teasing tone that she loved, followed his natural inclinations, and sometimes pricked too near the quick, frightened and broke her by a deep, tense fury which seemed to fix on him and hold him for days, and which she would give anything to placate in him. They were two very separate beings, vitally connected, knowing nothing of each other, yet living in their separate ways from one root. There were 4 sons and 2 daughters. The eldest boy ran away early to sea and did not come back. After this, the mother was more the node and center of attraction in the home. The second boy, Alfred, whom the mother admired most, was the most reserved. He was sent to school in Ilkeston and made some progress. But in spite of his dogged, yearning effort, he could not get beyond the rudiments of anything, save of drawing. At this, in which he had some power, he worked as if it were his hope. After much grumbling and savage rebellion against everything, after much trying and shifting about, when his father was incensed against him and his mother almost despairing, he became a draftsman in a lace factory in Nottingham. He remained heavy and somewhat uncouth, speaking with broad Derbyshire accent, adhering with all his tenacity to his work and to his town position, making good designs, and becoming fairly well off. But at drawing, his hand swung naturally in big, bold lines, rather lax, so that it was cruel for him to pedal away at the lace designing, working from the tiny squares of his paper, counting and plotting and niggling. He did it stubbornly, with anguish, crushing the bowels within him, adhering to his chosen lot whatever it should cost. And he came back into life set and rigid, a rare-spoken, almost surly man. He married the daughter of a chemist who affected some social superiority, and he became something of a snob, in his dogged fashion, with a passion for outward refinement in the household, mad when anything clumsy or gross occurred. Later, when his 3 children were growing up, and he seemed a staid, almost middle-aged man, he turned after strange women and became a silent, inscrutable follower of forbidden pleasure, neglecting his indignant bourgeois wife without a qualm. Frank, the 3rd son, refused from the first to have anything to do with learning. From the first, he hung round the slaughterhouse which stood away in the 3rd yard at the back of the farm. The Brangwens had always killed their own meat and supplied the neighborhood. Out of this grew a regular butcher's business in connection with the farm. As a child, Frank had been drawn by the trickle of dark blood that ran across the pavement from the slaughterhouse to the crew yard, by the sight of the man carrying across to the meat shed a huge side of beef, with the kidneys showing, embedded in their heavy laps of fat. He was a handsome lad with soft brown hair and regular features, something like a later Roman youth. He was more easily excitable, more readily carried away than the rest, weaker in character. At 18, he married a little factory girl, a pale, plump, quiet thing with sly eyes and a wheedling voice, who insinuated herself into him and bore him a child every year and made a fool of him. When he had taken over the butchery business, already a growing callousness to it, and a sort of contempt made him neglectful of it. He drank, and was often to be found in his public house blathering away as if he knew everything, when in reality he was a noisy fool. Of the daughters, Alice, the elder, married a collier and lived for a time stormily in Ilkeston, before moving away to Yorkshire with her numerous young family. Effie, the younger, remained at home. The last child, Tom, was considerably younger than his brothers, so had belonged rather to the company of his sisters. He was his mother's favorite. She roused herself to determination and sent him forcibly away to a grammar school in Derby when he was 12 years old. He did not want to go, and his father would have given way, but Mrs. Brangwen had set her heart on it. Her slender, pretty, tightly covered body, with full skirts, was now the center of resolution in the house, and when she had once set upon anything, which was not often, the family failed before her. So Tom went to school, an unwilling failure from the first. He believed his mother was right in decreeing school for him, but he knew she was only right because she would not acknowledge his constitution. He knew, with a child's deep, instinctive foreknowledge of what is going to happen to him, that he would cut a sorry figure at school. But he took the infliction as inevitable, as if he were guilty of his own nature, as if his being were wrong, and his mother's conception right. If he could have been what he liked, he would have been that which his mother fondly, but deludedly hoped he was. He would have been clever and capable of becoming a gentleman. It was her aspiration for him. Therefore, he knew it as the true aspiration for any boy. But you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, as he told his mother very early, with regard to himself, much to her mortification and chagrin. When he got to school, he made a violent struggle against his physical inability to study. He sat gripped, making himself pale and ghastly in his effort to concentrate on the book, to take in what he had to learn. But it was no good. If he beat down his first repulsion and got like a suicide to the stuff, he went very little further. He could not learn deliberately. His mind simply did not work. In feeling, he was developed, sensitive to the atmosphere around him, brutal perhaps, but at the same time delicate, very delicate. So he had a low opinion of himself. He knew his own limitation. He knew that his brain was a slow, hopeless good-for-nothing. So he was humble, but at the same time his feelings were more discriminating than those of most of the boys, and he was confused. He was more sensuously developed, more refined in instinct than they. For their mechanical stupidity, he hated them and suffered cruel contempt for them. But when it came to mental things, then he was at a disadvantage. He was at their mercy. He was a fool. He had not the power to controvert even the most stupid argument, so that he was forced to admit things he did not in the least believe. And having admitted them, he did not know whether he believed them or not. He rather thought he did. But he loved anyone who could convey enlightenment to him through feeling. He sat betrayed with emotion when the teacher of literature read, in a moving fashion, Tennyson's Ulysses, or Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. His lips parted, his eyes filled with a strained, almost suffering light. And the teacher read on, fired by his power over the boy. Tom Brangwen was moved by this experience beyond all calculation. He almost dreaded it. It was so deep. But when, almost secretly and shamefully, he came to take the book himself and began the words, "O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being," the very fact of the print caused a prickly sensation of repulsion to go over his skin. The blood came to his face, his heart filled with a bursting passion of rage and incompetence. He threw the book down and walked over it, and went out to the cricket field. And he hated books as if they were his enemies. He hated them worse than ever he hated any person. He could not voluntarily control his attention. His mind had no fixed habits to go by. He had nothing to get hold of, nowhere to start from. For him there was nothing palpable, nothing known in himself, that he could apply to learning. He did not know how to begin. Therefore, he was helpless when it came to deliberate understanding or deliberate learning. He had an instinct for mathematics, but if this failed him, he was helpless as an idiot. So that he felt that the ground was never sure under his feet. He was nowhere. His final downfall was his complete inability to attend to a question put without suggestion. If he had to write a formal composition on the army, he did at last learn to repeat the few facts he knew. You can join the army at 18. You have to be over 5'8". But he had all the time a living conviction that this was a dodge, and that his commonplaces were beneath contempt. Then he reddened furiously, felt his bowels sink with shame, scratched out what he had written, made an agonized effort to think of something in the real composition style, failed, became sullen with rage and humiliation, put the pen down, and would have been torn to pieces rather than attempt to write another word. He soon got used to the grammar school, and the grammar school got used to him, setting him down as a hopeless duffer at learning, but respecting him for a generous, honest nature. Only one narrow, domineering fellow, the Latin master, bullied him, and made the blue eyes mad with shame and rage. There was a horrid scene when the boy laid open the master's head with a slate, and then things went on as before. The teacher got little sympathy, but Brangwen winced and could not bear to think of the deed, not even long after, when he was a grown man. He was glad to leave school. It had not been unpleasant. He had enjoyed the companionship of the other youths, or had thought he enjoyed it. The time had passed very quickly, in endless activity. But he knew all the time that he was in an ignominious position, in this place of learning. He was aware of failure all the while, of incapacity. But he was too healthy and sanguine to be wretched. He was too much alive. Yet his soul was wretched almost to hopelessness. He had loved one warm, clever boy who was frail in body, a consumptive type. The two had had an almost classic friendship, David and Jonathan, wherein Brangwen was the Jonathan, the server. But he had never felt equal with his friend, because the other's mind outpaced his and left him ashamed, far in the rear. So the two boys went at once apart on leaving school. But Brangwen always remembered his friend that had been, kept him as a sort of light, a fine experience to remember. Tom Brangwen was glad to get back to the farm, where he was in his own again. "I've got a turnip on my shoulders, let me stick to teach fallow," he said to his exasperated mother. He had too low an opinion of himself, but he went about at his work on the farm gladly enough, glad of the active labor and the smell of the land again, having youth and vigor and humor and a comic wit, having the will and the power to forget his own shortcomings, finding himself violent with occasional rages, but usually on good terms with everybody and everything. When he was 17, his father fell from a stack and broke his neck. Then the mother and son and daughter lived on at the farm, interrupted by occasional loud-mouthed lamenting, jealous-spirited visitations from the butcher Frank, who had a grievance against the world, which he felt was always giving him less than his dues. Frank was particularly against the young Tom, whom he called a Marty baby, and Tom returned the hatred violently, his face growing red and his blue eyes staring. Effie sided with Tom against Frank, but when Alfred came, from Nottingham, heavy-jowled and lowering, speaking very little, but treating those at home with some contempt, Effie and the mother sided with him and put Tom into the shade. It irritated the youth that his elder brother should be made something of a hero by the women, just because he didn't live at home and was a lace designer and almost a gentleman. But Alfred was something of a Prometheus bound, so the women loved him. Tom came later to understand his brother better. As youngest son, Tom felt some importance when the care of the farm devolved onto him. He was only 18, but he was quite capable of doing everything his father had done. And of course, his mother remained as center to the house. The young man grew up very fresh and alert, with zest for every moment of life. He worked and rode and drove to market. He went out with companions and got tipsy occasionally and played skittles and went to the little traveling theaters. Once, when he was drunk at a public house, he went upstairs with a prostitute who seduced him. He was then 19. The thing was something of a shock to him. In the close intimacy of the farm kitchen, the woman occupied the supreme position. The men deferred to her in the house, on all household points, on all points of morality and behavior. The woman was the symbol for that further life, which comprised religion and love and morality. The men placed in her hands their own conscience. They said to her, "Be my conscience keeper, be the angel at the doorway guarding my outgoing and my incoming." And the woman fulfilled her trust. The men rested implicitly in her, receiving her praise or her blame with pleasure or with anger, rebelling and storming, but never for a moment really escaping in their own souls from her prerogative. They depended on her for their stability. Without her, they would have felt like straws in the wind, to be blown hither and thither at random. She was the anchor and the security. She was the restraining hand of God, at times highly to be execrated. Now when Tom Brangwen, at 19, a youth fresh like a plant, rooted in his mother and his sister, found that he had lain with a prostitute woman in a common public house, he was very much startled. For him there was until that time only one kind of woman, his mother and sister. But now, he did not know what to feel. There was a slight wonder, a pang of anger, of disappointment, a first taste of ash and of cold fear lest this was all that would happen, lest his relations with women were going to be no more than this nothingness. There was a slight sense of shame before the prostitute, fear that she would despise him for his inefficiency. There was a cold distaste for her, and a fear of her. There was a moment of paralyzed horror when he felt he might have taken a disease from her, and upon all this startled tumult of emotion was laid the steadying hand of common sense, which said it did not matter very much, so long as he had no disease. He soon recovered balance, and really it did not matter so very much. But it had shocked him and put a mistrust into his heart and emphasized his fear. Or apparently so. He had, in fact, lost some of his buoyant confidence, and doubt hindered his outgoing. For some time after this, he was quieter, more conscious when he drank, more backward from companionship. The disillusion of his first carnal contact with woman, strengthened by his innate desire to find in a woman the embodiment of all his inarticulate, powerful religious impulses, put a bit in his mouth. He had something to lose which he was afraid of losing, which he was not sure even of possessing. This first affair did not matter much, but the business of love was, at the bottom of his soul, the most serious and terrifying of all to him. He was tormented now with sex desire. His imagination reverted always to lustful scenes. But what really prevented his returning to a loose woman, over and above the natural squeamishness, was the recollection of the paucity of the last experience. It had been so nothing, so dribbling and functional, that he was ashamed to expose himself to the risk of a repetition of it. He made a strong, instinctive fight to retain his native cheerfulness unimpaired. He had naturally a plentiful stream of life and humor, a sense of sufficiency and exuberance, giving ease. But now it tended to cause tension. A strained light came into his eyes. He had a slight knitting of the brows. His boisterous humor gave place to lowering silences, and days passed by in a sort of suspense. He did not know there was any difference in him, exactly. For the most part, he was filled with slow anger and resentment. But he knew he was always thinking of women, or a woman, day in, day out, and that infuriated him. He could not get free, and he was ashamed. He had one or two sweethearts, starting with them in the hope of speedy development. But when he had a nice girl, he found that he was incapable of pushing the desired development. The very presence of the girl beside him made it impossible. He could not think of her like that. He could not think of her actual nakedness. She was a girl, and he liked her, and dreaded violently even the thought of uncovering her. He knew that in these last issues of nakedness, he did not exist to her nor she to him. Again, if he had a loose girl, and things began to develop, she offended him so deeply all the time that he never knew whether he was going to get away from her as quickly as possible, or whether he were going to take her out of inflamed necessity. Again, he learned his lesson. If he took her, it was a paucity which he was forced to despise. He did not despise himself, nor the girl, but he despised the net result in him of the experience. He despised it deeply and bitterly. Then, when he was 23, his mother died, and he was left at home with Effie. His mother's death was another blow out of the dark. He could not understand it. He knew it was no good as trying. One had to submit to these unforeseen blows that come unawares and leave a bruise that remains and hurts whenever it is touched. He began to be afraid of all that which was up against him. He had loved his mother. After this, Effie and he quarreled fiercely. They meant a very great deal to each other, but they were both under a strange, unnatural tension. He stayed out of the house as much as possible. He got a special corner for himself at the Red Lion at Casathe and became a usual figure by the fire. A fresh, fair young fellow with heavy limbs and head held back, mostly silent, though alert and attentive, very hearty in his greeting of everybody he knew, shy of strangers. He teased all the women, who liked him extremely, and he was very attentive to the talk of the men, very respectful. To drink made him quickly flush very red in the face, and brought out the look of self-consciousness and unsureness, almost bewilderment, in his blue eyes. When he came home in this state of tipsy confusion, his sister hated him and abused him, and he went off his head like a mad bull with rage. He had still another turn with a light Olaf. One Whitsuntide, he went a jaunt with two other young fellows on horseback to Matlock and thence to Bakewell. Matlock was at that time just becoming a famous beauty spot, visited from Manchester and from the Staffordshire towns. In the hotel where the young men took lunch were two girls, and the parties struck up a friendship. The miss who made up to Tom Brangwen, then 24 years old, was a handsome, reckless girl neglected for an afternoon by the man who had brought her out. She saw Brangwen and liked him, as all women did, for his warmth and his generous nature, and for the innate delicacy in him. But she saw he was one who would have to be brought to the scratch. However, she was roused and unsatisfied and made mischievous, so she dared anything. It would be an easy interlude, restoring her pride. She was a handsome girl with a bosom and dark hair and blue eyes, a girl full of easy laughter, flushed from the sun, inclined to wipe her laughing face in a very natural and taking manner. Brangwen was in a state of wonder. He treated her with his chaffing deference, roused, but very unsure of himself, afraid to death of being too forward, ashamed lest he might be thought backward, mad with desire, yet restrained by instinctive regard for women from making any definite approach, feeling all the while that his attitude was ridiculous, and flushing deep with confusion. She, however, became hard and daring as he became confused. It amused her to see him come on. "When must you get back?" she asked. "I'm not particular," he said. There the conversation again broke down. Brangwen's companions were ready to go on. "Art common, Tom," they called, or "Art for stoppin'?" I'm common," he replied, rising reluctantly, an angry sense of futility and disappointment spreading over him. He met the full, almost taunting look of the girl, and he trembled with amusedness. "Shall you come and have a look at my mare?" he said to her, with his hearty kindliness that was now shaken with trepidation. "Oh, I should like to," she said, rising. And she followed him, his rather sloping shoulders and his cloth riding gaiters, out of the room. The young men got their own horses out of the stable. "Can you ride?" Brangwen asked her. "I should like to if I could. I have never tried," she said. "Come then and have a try," he said. And he lifted her, he blushing, she laughing, into the saddle. "I ass'll slip off. It's not a lady's saddle," she cried. "Hold your tight," he said, and he led her out of the hotel gate. The girl sat very insecurely, clinging fast. He put a hand on her waist to support her, and he held her closely. He clasped her as in an embrace. He was weak with desire as he strode beside her. The horse walked by the river. "You want to sit straddle-leg," he said to her. "I know I do," she said. It was the time of very full skirts. She managed to get astride the horse, quite decently, showing an intent concern for covering her pretty leg. "It's a lots better this road," she said, looking down at him. It is," he said, feeling the marrow melt in his bones from the look in her eyes. "I dunno why they have that side saddle business, twistin' a woman in two." "Should us leave you, then? You seem to be fixed up there?" called Brangwen's companions from the road. He went red with anger. Don't worry," he called back. "How long are you stoppin'?" they asked. "Not after Christmas," he said. And the girl gave a tinkling peal of laughter. "All right, bye-bye," called his friends. And they cantered off, leaving him very flushed, trying to be quite normal with the girl. But presently, he had gone back to the hotel and given his horse into the charge of an ostler and had gone off with the girl into the woods, not quite knowing where he was or what he was doing. His heart thumped, and he thought it the most glorious adventure and was mad with desire for the girl. Afterwards, he glowed with pleasure. By Jove, but that was something like. He stayed the afternoon with the girl and wanted to stay the night. She, however, told him this was impossible. Her own man would be back by dark, and she must be with him. He, Brangwen, must not let on that there had been anything between them. She gave him an intimate smile, which made him feel confused and gratified. He could not tear himself away, though he had promised not to interfere with the girl. He stayed on at the hotel overnight. He saw the other fellow at the evening meal, a small, middle-aged man with iron-gray hair and a curious face, like a monkey's, but interesting, in its way almost beautiful. Brangwen guessed that he was a foreigner. He was in company with another, an Englishman, dry and hard. The four sat at table, 2 men and 2 women. Brangwen watched with all his eyes. He saw how the foreigner treated the women with courteous contempt, as if they were pleasing animals. Brangwen's girl had put on a ladylike manner, but her voice betrayed her. She wanted to win back her man. When dessert came on, however, the little foreigner turned round from his table and calmly surveyed the room, like one unoccupied. Brangwen marveled over the cold, animal intelligence of the face. The brown eyes were round, showing all the brown pupil, like a monkey's, and just calmly looking, perceiving the other person without referring to him at all. They rested on Brangwen. The latter marveled at the old face turned round on him, looking at him without considering it necessary to know him at all. The eyebrows of the round, perceiving, but unconcerned eyes were rather high up, with slight wrinkles above them, just as a monkey's had. It was an old, ageless face. The man was most amazingly a gentleman all the time, an aristocrat. Brangwen stared fascinated. The girl was pushing her crumbs about on the cloth, uneasily, flushed and angry. As Brangwen sat motionless in the hall afterwards, too much moved and lost to know what to do, the little stranger came up to him with a beautiful smile and manner, offering a cigarette and saying, "Will you smoke?" Brangwen never smoked cigarettes, yet he took the one offered, fumbling painfully with thick fingers, blushing to the roots of his hair. Then he looked with his warm blue eyes at the almost sardonic, lidded eyes of the foreigner. The latter sat down beside him, and they began to talk, chiefly of horses. Brangwen loved the other man for his exquisite graciousness, for his tact and reserve, and for his ageless, monkey-like self-surety. They talked of horses, and of Derbyshire, and of farming. The stranger warmed to the young fellow with real warmth, and Brangwen was excited. He was transported at meeting this odd, middle-aged, dry-skinned man. Personally, the talk was pleasant, but that did not matter so much. It was the gracious manner, the fine contact that was all. They talked a long while together, Brangwen flushing like a girl when the other did not understand his idiom. Then they said good night and shook hands. Again the foreigner bowed and repeated his good night. Good night and bon voyage. Then he turned to the stairs. Brangwen went up to his room and lay staring out at the stars of the summer night, his whole being in a whirl. What was it all? There was a life so different from what he knew it. What was there outside his knowledge? How much? What was this that he had touched? What was he in this new influence? What did everything mean? Where was life? In that which he knew, or all outside him? He fell asleep, and in the morning had ridden away before any other visitors were awake. He shrank from seeing any of them again in the morning. His mind was one big excitement, the girl and the foreigner. He knew neither of their names. Yet they had set fire to the homestead of his nature, and he would be burned out of cover. Of the two experiences, perhaps the meeting with the foreigner was the more significant. But the girl, he had not settled about the girl. He did not know. He had to leave it there as it was. He could not sum up his experiences. The result of these encounters was that he dreamed day and night, absorbedly, of a voluptuous woman and of the meeting with a small, withered foreigner of ancient breeding. No sooner was his mind free, no sooner had he left his own companions, than he began to imagine an intimacy with fine-textured, subtle-mannered people such as the foreigner at Matlock, and amidst this subtle intimacy was always the satisfaction of a voluptuous woman. He went about absorbed in the interest and the actuality of this dream. His eyes glowed. He walked with his head up, full of the exquisite pleasure of aristocratic subtlety and grace, tormented with the desire for the girl. Then gradually the glow began to fade, and the cold material of his customary life to show through. He resented it. Was he cheated in his illusion? He balked the mean enclosure of reality, stood stubbornly like a bull at a gate, refusing to re-enter the well-known round of his own life.
He drank more than usual to keep up the glow. But it faded more and more for all that. He set his teeth at the commonplace, to which he would not submit. It resolved itself starkly before him, for all that.
He wanted to marry, to get settled somehow, to get out of the quandary he found himself in. But how? He felt unable to move his limbs. He had seen a little creature caught in birdlime, and the sight was a nightmare to him. He began to feel mad with the rage of impotency. He wanted something to get hold of, to pull himself out, but there was nothing. Steadfastly, he looked at the young women, to find a one he could marry. But not one of them did he want, and he knew that the idea of a life among such people as the foreigner was ridiculous. Yet he dreamed of it, and stuck to his dreams, and would not have the reality of Kossuth and Ilkeston. There he sat stubbornly in his corner at the Red Lion, smoking and musing and occasionally lifting his beer pot, and saying nothing, for all the world like a gawping farm laborer, as he said himself. Then a fever of restless anger came upon him. He wanted to go away, right away. He dreamed of foreign parts, but somehow he had no contact with them. And it was a very strong root which held him to the marsh, to his own house and land. Then Effie got married, and he was left in the house with only Tilly, the cross-eyed woman servant who had been with them for 15 years. He felt things coming to a close. All the time, he had held himself stubbornly resistant to the action of the commonplace unreality which wanted to absorb him. But now he had to do something. He was by nature temperate. Being sensitive and emotional, his nausea prevented him from drinking too much. But in futile anger, with the greatest of determination and apparent good humor, he began to drink in order to get drunk. "Damn it," he said to himself. "You must have it one road or another. You can't hitch your horse to the shadow of a gatepost. If you've got legs, you've got to rise off your backside some time or other." So he rose and went down to Ilkeston, rather awkwardly took his place among a gang of young bloods, stood drinks to the company, and discovered he could carry it off quite well. He had an idea that everybody in the room was a man after his own heart, that everything was glorious, everything was perfect. When somebody in alarm told him his coat pocket was on fire, he could only beam from a red, blissful face and say, "ISS all right, ISS all right, it's a right, let it be, let it be." And he laughed with pleasure, and was rather indignant that the others should think it unnatural for his coat pocket to burn. It was the happiest and most natural thing in the world, what? He went home talking to himself and to the moon, that was very high and small, stumbling at the flashes of moonlight from the puddles at his feet, wondering what the Hanover, then laughing confidently to the moon, assuring her this was first class, this was. In the morning he woke up and thought about it, and for the first time in his life, knew what it was to feel really acutely irritable, in a misery of real bad temper. After bawling and snarling at Tilly, he took himself off for very shame, to be alone. And looking at the ashen fields and the putty roads, he wondered what in the name of hell he could do to get out of this prickly sense of disgust and physical repulsion. And he knew that this was the result of his glorious evening. And his stomach did not want any more brandy. He went doggedly across the fields with his terrier and looked at everything with a jaundiced eye. The next evening found him back again in his place at the Red Lion, moderate and decent. There he sat and stubbornly waited for what would happen next. Did he, or did he not believe that he belonged to this world of Kossuth and Ilkeston? There was nothing in it he wanted, yet could he ever get out of it? Was there anything in himself that would carry him out of it? Or was he a dunderhead baby, not man enough to be like the other young fellows who drank a good deal and wenched a little without any question, and were satisfied? He went on stubbornly for a time. Then the strain became too great for him. A hot, accumulated consciousness was always awake in his chest. His wrists felt swelled and quivering. His mind became full of lustful images. His eyes seemed blood-flushed. He fought with himself furiously to remain normal. He did not seek any woman. He just went on as if he were normal, till he must either take some action or beat his head against the wall. Then he went deliberately to Ilkeston, in silence, intent and beaten. He drank to get drunk. He gulped down the brandy and more brandy, till his face became pale, his eyes burning, and still he could not get free. He went to sleep in drunken unconsciousness, woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning and continued drinking. He would get free. Gradually, the tension in him began to relax. He began to feel happy. His riveted silence was unfastened. He began to talk and babble. He was happy and at one with all the world. He was united with all flesh in a hot blood relationship. So, after 3 days of incessant brandy drinking, he had burned out the youth from his blood. He had achieved this kindled state of oneness with all the world, which is the end of youth's most passionate desire. But he had achieved his satisfaction by obliterating his own individuality, that which it depended on his manhood to preserve and develop. So he became a bout drinker, having at intervals these bouts of 3 or 4 days of brandy drinking when he was drunk for the whole time.
He did not think about it.
A deep resentment burned in him. He kept aloof from any women antagonistic. When he was 28, a thick-limbed, stiff, fair man with fresh complexion and blue eyes staring very straight ahead, he was coming one day down from Kossuth with a load of seed out of Nottingham. It was a time when he was getting ready for another bout of drinking, so he stared fixedly before him, watchful yet absorbed, seeing everything and aware of nothing, coiled in himself. It was early in the year. He walked steadily beside the horse. The load clinked behind as the hill descended steeper. The road curved downhill before him under banks and hedges, seen only for a few yards ahead. Slowly turning the curve at the steepest part of the slope, his horse britching between the shafts, he saw a woman approaching. But he was thinking for the moment of the horse. Then he turned to look at her. She was dressed in black, was apparently rather small and slight, beneath her long black cloak, and she wore a black bonnet. She walked hastily, as if unseeing, her head rather forward. It was her curious, absorbed, flitting motion, as if she were passing unseen by everybody, that first arrested him. She had heard the cart and looked up. Her face was pale and clear. She had thick dark eyebrows and a wide mouth, curiously held. He saw her face clearly, as if by a light in the air. He saw her face so distinctly that he ceased to coil on himself and was suspended. "That's her," he said involuntarily. As the cart passed by, splashing through the thin mud, she stood back against the bank. Then, as he walked still beside his britching horse, his eyes met hers. He looked quickly away, pressing back his head, a pain of joy running through him. He could not bear to think of anything. He turned round at the last moment. He saw her bonnet, her shape in the black cloak, the movement as she walked. Then she was gone round the bend. She had passed by. He felt as if he were walking again in a far world, not Kossuth, a far world, the fragile reality. He went on, quiet, suspended, rarefied. He could not bear to think or to speak, nor make any sound or sign, nor change his fixed motion. He could scarcely bear to think of her face. He moved within the knowledge of her, in the world that was beyond reality. The feeling that they had exchanged recognition possessed him like a madness, like a torment. How could he be sure? What confirmation had he? The doubt was like a sense of infinite space, a nothingness, annihilating. He kept within his breast the will to surety. They had exchanged recognition. He walked about in this state for the next few days. And then again, like a mist, it began to break to let through the common, barren world. He was very gentle with man and beast, but he dreaded the starkness of disillusion cropping through again. As he was standing with his back to the fire after dinner a few days later, he saw the woman passing. He wanted to know that she knew him, that she was aware. He wanted it said that there was something between them. So he stood anxiously watching, looking at her as she went down the road.
He called to Tilly.
"Who might that be?" he asked. Tilly, the cross-eyed woman of 40, who adored him, ran gladly to the window to look. She was glad when he asked her for anything. She craned her head over the short curtain, the little tight knob of her black hair sticking out pathetically as she bobbed about. Oh, why? She lifted her head and peered with her twisted, keen brown eyes. "Why, you know who it is. It's her from the vicarage, you know." "How do I know, you hen bird?" he shouted. Tilly blushed and drew her neck in and looked at him with her squinting, sharp, almost reproachful look. "Why, you do. It's the new housekeeper." And what by that?" Well, and what by that? Rejoined the indignant Tilly. She's a woman, isn't she? Housekeeper or no housekeeper. She's got more to her than that. Who is she? She's got a name. Well, if she has, I don't know, retorted Tilly, not to be badgered by this lad who had grown up into a man. What's her name? He asked more gently. I'm sure I couldn't tell you, replied Tilly on her dignity. And is that all as you've gathered, as she's housekeeping at the vicarage? I've eared mention of her name, but I couldn't remember it for my life. Why, you're riddle-skulled woman, oh nonsense. What have you got a head for? For what other folks has got theirs for, retorted Tilly, who loved nothing more than these tilts when he would call her names. There was a lull. I don't believe as anybody could keep it in their head, the woman servant continued, tentatively. What? He asked. Why, her name. How's that? She's from some foreign parts or other.
Who told you that?
That's all I do know as she is. And where do you reckon she's from then? I don't know. They do say as she hails fra Teach Pole. I don't know, Tilly hastened to add, knowing he would attack her. Fra Th Pole. Why do you hail Fra Th Pole? Who set up that menagerie confabulation? That's what they say, I don't know. Who says? Mrs. Bentley says as she's Fra Teach Pole, else she's a pole or summit. Tilly was only afraid. She was landing herself deeper now. Who says she's a pole? They all say so. Then what's brought her to these parts? I couldn't tell you. She's got a little girl with her. Got a little girl with her? Of 3 or 4, with a head like a fuzzball. Black. White. Fair as can be, and all of a fuzz. Is there a father, then? Not to my knowledge. I don't know. What brought her here? I couldn't say. Without Teach Vicar axed her. Is the child her child? ISD thinks so. They say so. Who told you about her? Why, Lizzie, a Monday. We seed her going past. You'd have to be rattling your tongues if anything went past. Brangwen stood musing. That evening he went up to Kossethe to the Red Lion, half with the intention of hearing more. She was the widow of a Polish doctor, he gathered. Her husband had died, a refugee, in London. She spoke a bit foreign-like, but you could easily make out what she said. She had one little girl named Anna. Lenski was the woman's name, Mrs. Lenski. Brangwen felt that here was the unreality established at last. He felt also a curious certainty about her, as if she were destined to him. It was to him a profound satisfaction that she was a foreigner. A swift change had taken place on the earth for him, as if a new creation were fulfilled, in which he had real existence. Things had all been stark, unreal, barren, mere nullities before. Now they were actualities that he could handle. He dared scarcely think of the woman. He was afraid. Only all the time he was aware of her presence, not far off. He lived in her. But he dared not know her, even acquaint himself with her by thinking of her. One day he met her walking along the road with her little girl. It was a child with a face like a bud of apple blossom and glistening fair hair like thistledown sticking out in straight, wild, flamy pieces and very dark eyes. The child clung jealously to her mother's side when he looked at her, staring with resentful black eyes. But the mother glanced at him again, almost vacantly, and the very vacancy of her look inflamed him. She had wide gray-brown eyes with very dark, fathomless pupils. He felt the fine flame running under his skin, as if all his veins had caught fire on the surface. And he went on walking without knowledge. It was coming, he knew, his fate. The world was submitting to its transformation. He made no move. It would come what would come. When his sister Effie came to the marsh for a week, he went with her for once to church. In the tiny place, with its mere dozen pews, he sat not far from the stranger. There was a fineness about her, a poignancy about the way she sat and held her head lifted. She was strange, from far off, yet so intimate. She was from far away, a presence so close to his soul. She was not really there, sitting in Kossethe church beside her little girl. She was not living the apparent life of her days. She belonged to somewhere else. He felt it poignantly, as something real and natural. But a pang of fear for his own concrete life, that was only Kosithe, hurt him and gave him misgiving. Her thick dark brows almost met above her irregular nose. She had a wide, rather thick mouth. But her face was lifted to another world of life, not to heaven or death, but to some place where she still lived, in spite of her body's absence. The child beside her watched everything with wide, black eyes. She had an odd little defiant look. Her little red mouth was pinched shut. She seemed to be jealously guarding something, to be always on the alert for defense. She met Brangwen's near, vacant, intimate gaze, and a palpitating hostility, almost like a flame of pain, came into the wide, overconscious dark eyes. The old clergyman droned on. Kosithe sat unmoved as usual. And there was the foreign woman with a foreign air about her, inviolate, and the strange child, also foreign, jealously guarding something. When the service was over, he walked in the way of another existence out of the church. As he went down the church path with his sister, behind the woman and child, the little girl suddenly broke from her mother's hand and slipped back with quick, almost invisible movement, and was picking at something almost under Brangwen's feet. Her tiny fingers were fine and quick, but they missed the red button. "Have you found something?" said Brangwen to her. And he also stooped for the button. But she had got it, and she stood back with it pressed against her little coat, her black eyes flaring at him, as if to forbid him to notice her. Then, having silenced him, she turned with a swift "mother," and was gone down the path. The mother had stood watching impassive, looking not at the child, but at Brangwen. He became aware of the woman looking at him, standing there isolated yet for him dominant in her foreign existence. He did not know what to do, and turned to his sister. But the wide gray eyes, almost vacant yet so moving, held him beyond himself. "Mother, I may have it, mayn't I?" came the child's proud, silvery tones. Mother. She seemed always to be calling her mother to remember her. Mother, and she had nothing to continue now her mother had replied, "Yes, my child." But, with ready invention, the child stumbled and ran on. "What are those people's names?" Brangwen heard the abstract. "I don't know, dear." He went on down the road as if he were not living inside himself, but somewhere outside. "Who is that person?" his sister Effie asked. "I couldn't tell you," he answered, unknowing. "She's somebody very funny," said Effie, almost in condemnation. "That child's like one bewitched." "Bewitched? How bewitched?" he repeated. "You can see for yourself. The mother's plain, I must say, but the child is like a changeling. She'd be about 35. But he took no notice. His sister talked on. "There's your woman for you," she continued. "You'd better marry her." But still he took no notice. Things were as they were. Another day, at tea time, as he sat alone at table, there came a knock at the front door. It startled him like a portent. No one ever knocked at the front door. He rose and began slotting back the bolts, turning the big key. When he had opened the door, the strange woman stood on the threshold. "Can you give me a pound of butter?" she asked, in a curious detached way of one speaking a foreign language. He tried to attend to her question. She was looking at him questioningly. But underneath the question, what was there, in her very standing motionless, which affected him? He stepped aside, and she at once entered the house, as if the door had been opened to admit her. That startled him. It was the custom for everybody to wait on the doorstep till asked inside. He went into the kitchen, and she followed. His tea things were spread on the scrubbed deal table. A big fire was burning. A dog rose from the hearth and went to her. She stood motionless just inside the kitchen. "Tilly," he called loudly, "have we got any butter?" The stranger stood there like a silence in her black cloak. Came the shrill cry from the distance. He shouted his question again. "We've got what's on tea table," answered Tilly's shrill voice out of the dairy. Brangwen looked at the table. There was a large pat of butter on a plate, almost a pound. It was round and stamped with acorns and oak leaves. "Can't you come when you're wanted?" he shouted. "Why, what do you want?" Tilly protested, as she came peeking inquisitively through the other door. She saw the strange woman, stared at her with cross eyes, but said nothing. "Haven't we any butter?" asked Brangwen again, impatiently, as if he could command some by his question. I tell you there's what's on tea table, said Tilly, impatient that she was unable to create any to his demand. We haven't a morsel besides. There was a moment's silence. The stranger spoke, in her curiously distinct, detached manner of one who must think her speech first. Oh, then thank you very much. I am sorry that I have come to trouble you. She could not understand the entire lack of manners, was slightly puzzled. Any politeness would have made the situation quite impersonal. But here it was a case of wills in confusion. Brangwen flushed at her polite speech. Still, he did not let her go. Get Summit and wrap that up for her, he said to Tilly, looking at the butter on the table. And taking a clean knife, he cut off that side of the butter where it was touched. His speech, the for her, penetrated slowly into the foreign woman and angered Tilly. Vicar has his butter fra Browns by rights, said the insuppressible servant woman. We us'll be churnin' tomorrow mornin' first thing. Yes, the long-drawn foreign yes. Yes, said the Polish woman. I went to Mrs. Brown's. She hasn't any more. Tilly bridled her head, bursting to say that, according to the etiquette of people who bought butter, it was no sort of manners whatever coming to a place cool as you like and knocking at the front door asking for a pound as a stopgap while your other people were short. If you go to Brown's, you go to Brown's, and my butter isn't just to make shift when Brown's has got none. Brangwen understood perfectly this unspoken speech of Tilly's. The Polish lady did not, and as she wanted butter for the vicar, and as Tilly was churning in the morning, she waited. Slut her up now, said Brangwen loudly after this silence had resolved itself out, and Tilly disappeared through the inner door. I am afraid that I should not come so, said the stranger, looking at him inquiringly, as if referring to him for what it was usual to do. He felt confused. How's that? He said, trying to be genial and being only protective. Do you? She began deliberately. But she was not sure of her ground, and the conversation came to an end. Her eyes looked at him all the while, because she could not speak the language. They stood facing each other. The dog walked away from her to him. He bent down to it. And how's your little girl? He asked. Yes, thank you. She is very well, was the reply, a phrase of polite speech in a foreign language merely. Sit you down, he said. And she sat in a chair, her slim arms, coming through the slits of her cloak, resting on her lap. You're not used to these parts, he said, still standing on the hearthrug with his back to the fire, coatless, looking with curious directness at the woman. Her self-possession pleased him and inspired him, set him curiously free. It seemed to him almost brutal to feel so master of himself and of the situation. Her eyes rested on him for a moment, questioning, as she thought of the meaning of his speech. No, she said, understanding. No, it is strange. You find it middlin' rough, he said. Her eyes waited on him, so that he should say it again. Our ways are rough to you, he repeated. Yes, yes, I understand. Yes, it is different, it is strange. But I was in Yorkshire. Oh, well then, he said, it's no worse here than what they are up there. She did not quite understand. His protective manner and his sureness and his intimacy puzzled her. What did he mean? If he was her equal, why did he behave so without formality? No, she said, vaguely, her eyes resting on him. She saw him fresh and naive, uncouth, almost entirely beyond relationship with her. Yet he was good-looking, with his fair hair and blue eyes full of energy, and with his healthy body that seemed to take equality with her. She watched him steadily. He was difficult for her to understand, warm, uncouth, and confident as he was, sure on his feet as if he did not know what it was to be unsure. What then was it that gave him this curious stability? She did not know. She wondered. She looked round the room he lived in. It had a close intimacy that fascinated and almost frightened her. The furniture was old and familiar as old people. The whole place seemed so kin to him, as if it partook of his being, that she was uneasy. It is already a long time that you have lived in this house, yes? She asked. I've always lived here, he said. Yes, but your people, your family? We've been here above 200 years, he said. Her eyes were on him all the time, wide open and trying to grasp him. He felt that he was there for her. "It is your own place, the house, the farm?" "Yes," he said. He looked down at her and met her look. It disturbed her.
She did not know him.
He was a foreigner. They had nothing to do with each other. Yet his look disturbed her to knowledge of him. He was so strangely confident and direct. "You live quite alone?" "Yes, if you call it alone." She did not understand. It seemed unusual to her. What was the meaning of it? And whenever her eyes, after watching him for some time, inevitably met his, she was aware of a heat beating up over her consciousness. She sat motionless and in conflict. Who was this strange man who was at once so near to her? What was happening to her? Something in his young, warm twinkling eyes seemed to assume a right to her, to speak to her, to extend her as protection. But how? Why did he speak to her? Why were his eyes so certain, so full of light and confident, waiting for no permission nor signal? Tilly returned with a large leaf and found the two silent. At once he felt it incumbent on him to speak. Now the serving woman had come back. "How old is your little girl?" he asked.
"For years," she replied.
"Her father hasn't been dead long, then?" he asked. "She was 1 year when he died." 3 years. "Yes, 3 years that he is dead, yes." Curiously quiet she was, almost abstracted, answering these questions. She looked at him again, with some maidenhood opening in her eyes. He felt he could not move, neither towards her nor away from her. Something about her presence hurt him, till he was almost rigid before her. He saw the girl's wondering look rise in her eyes. Tilly handed her the butter, and she rose. "Thank you very much," she said. "How much is it?" "We'll make the vicar a present of it," he said. "It'll do for me going to church." You'd look better of you if you went to church and took tish money for your butter," said Tilly, persistent in her claim to him. "You have to put in, shouldn't you?" he said. "How much, please?" said the Polish woman to Tilly. Brangwen stood by and let be. Then, "Thank you very much," she said. "Bring your little girl down sometime to look at fowls and horses," he said, "if she'd like it." "Yes, she would like it," said the stranger. And she went. Brangwen stood dimmed by her departure. He could not notice Tilly, who was looking at him uneasily, wanting to be reassured. He could not think of anything. He felt that he had made some invisible connection with this strange woman. A daze had come over his mind. He had another center of consciousness. In his breast, or in his bowels, somewhere in his body, there had started another activity. It was as if a strong light were burning there, and he was blind within it, unable to know anything, except that this transfiguration burned between him and her, connecting them like a secret power. Since she had come to the house, he went about in a daze, scarcely seeing even the things he handled, drifting, quiescent, in a state of metamorphosis. He submitted to that which was happening to him, letting go his will, suffering the loss of himself, dormant always on the brink of ecstasy, like a creature evolving to a new birth. She came twice with her child to the farm, but there was this lull between them, an intense calm and passivity like a torpor upon them, so that there was no active change took place. He was almost unaware of the child, yet by his native good humor he gained her confidence, even her affection, setting her on a horse to ride, giving her corn for the fowls. Once he drove the mother and child from Ilkeston, picking them up on the road. The child huddled close to him as if for love. The mother sat very still. There was a vagueness, like a soft mist over all of them, and a silence, as if their wills were suspended. Only he saw her hands, unloved, folded in her lap, and he noticed the wedding ring on her finger. It excluded him. It was a closed circle. It bound her life, the wedding ring. It stood for her life in which he could have no part. Nevertheless, beyond all this, there was herself and himself which should meet. As he helped her down from the trap, almost lifting her, he felt he had some right to take her thus between his hands. She belonged as yet to that other, to that which was behind. But he must care for her also. She was too living to be neglected. Sometimes her vagueness, in which he was lost, made him angry, made him rage. But he held himself still as yet. She had no response, no being towards him. It puzzled and enraged him, but he submitted for a long time. Then, From the accumulated troubling of her ignoring him, gradually a fury broke out, destructive, and he wanted to go away, to escape her. It happened she came down to the marsh with the child whilst he was in this state. Then he stood over against her, strong and heavy in his revolt, and though he said nothing, still she felt his anger and heavy impatience grip hold of her. She was shaken again, as out of a torpor. Again her heart stirred with a quick, outrunning impulse. She looked at him, at the stranger who was not a gentleman yet who insisted on coming into her life, and the pain of a new birth in herself strung all her veins to a new form. She would have to begin again, to find a new being, a new form, to respond to that blind, insistent figure standing over against her. A shiver, a sickness of new birth passed over her. The flame leaped up him, under his skin. She wanted it, this new life from him, with him, yet she must defend herself against it, for it was a destruction. As he worked alone on the land, or sat up with his ewes at lambing time, the facts and material of his daily life fell away, leaving the kernel of his purpose clean. And then it came upon him that he would marry her, and she would be his life. Gradually, even without seeing her, he came to know her. He would have liked to think of her as of something given into his protection, like a child without parents. But it was forbidden him. He had to come down from this pleasant view of the case. She might refuse him, and besides, he was afraid of her. But during the long February nights with the ewes in labor, looking out from the shelter into the flashing stars, he knew he did not belong to himself. He must admit that he was only fragmentary, something incomplete and subject. There were the stars in the dark heaven traveling, the whole host passing by on some eternal voyage. So he sat small and submissive to the greater ordering. Unless she would come to him, he must remain as a nothingness. It was a hard experience. But after her repeated obliviousness to him, after he had seen so often that he did not exist for her, after he had raged and tried to escape, and said he was good enough by himself, he was a man and could stand alone, he must, in the starry multiplicity of the night, humble himself and admit and know that without her he was nothing. He was nothing, but with her, he would be real. If she were now walking across the frosty grass near the sheep shelter, through the fretful bleating of the ewes and lambs, she would bring him completeness and perfection. And if it should be so, that she should come to him, it should be so, it was ordained so. He was a long time resolving definitely to ask her to marry him. And he knew, if he asked her, she must really acquiesce. She must, it could not be otherwise. He had learned a little of her. She was poor, quite alone, and had had a hard time in London, both before and after her husband died. But in Poland she was a lady well-born, a landowner's daughter. All these things were only words to him. The fact of her superior birth, the fact that her husband had been a brilliant doctor, the fact that he himself was her inferior in almost every way of distinction. There was an inner reality, a logic of the soul, which connected her with him. One evening in March, when the wind was roaring outside, came the moment to ask her. He had sat with his hands before him, leaning to the fire, and as he watched the fire, he knew almost without thinking that he was going this evening. "Have you got a clean shirt?" he asked Tilly. "You know you've got clean shirts," she said. "I bring me a white one." Tilly brought down one of the linen shirts he had inherited from his father, putting it before him to air at the fire. She loved him with a dumb, aching love as he sat leaning with his arms on his knees, still and absorbed, unaware of her. Lately, a quivering inclination to cry had come over her when she did anything for him in his presence. Now her hands trembled as she spread the shirt. He was never shouting and teasing now. The deep stillness there was in the house made her tremble. He went to wash himself. Queer little breaks of consciousness seemed to rise and burst like bubbles out of the depths of his stillness. "It's got to be done," he said as he stooped to take the shirt out of the fender. "It's got to be done, so why balk it?" And as he combed his hair before the mirror on the wall, he retorted to himself, superficially, "The woman's not speechless dumb. She's not clutterin' at the nipple. She's got the right to please herself and displease whosoever she likes." This streak of common sense carried him a little further. "Did you want anything?" asked Tilly, suddenly appearing, having heard him speak. She stood watching him comb his fair beard. His eyes were calm and uninterrupted. "Aye," he said. "Where have you put the scissors?" She brought them to him and stood watching as, chin forward, he trimmed his beard. "Don't go and crop yourself as if you was at a shearing contest," she said, anxiously. He blew the fine-curled hair quickly off his lips. He put on all clean clothes, folded his stock carefully, and donned his best coat. Then, being ready, as gray twilight was falling, he went across to the orchard to gather the daffodils. The wind was roaring in the apple trees. The yellow flowers swayed violently up and down. He heard even the fine whisper of their spears as he stooped to break the flattened, brittle stems of the flowers. "What's to do?" shouted a friend who met him as he left the garden gate. "Bit of cord, like," said Brangwen. And Tilly, in a great state of trepidation and excitement, let the wind whisk her over the field to the big gate, whence she could watch him go. He went up the hill and on towards the vicarage, the wind roaring through the hedges, whilst he tried to shelter his bunch of daffodils by his side. He did not think of anything, only knew that the wind was blowing. Night was falling. The bare trees drummed and whistled. The vicar, he knew, would be in his study, the Polish woman in the kitchen, a comfortable room, with her child. In the darkest of twilight, he went through the gate and down the path where a few daffodils stooped in the wind and shattered crocuses made a pale, colorless revel. There was a light streaming on to the bushes at the back from the kitchen window. He began to hesitate. How could he do this? Looking through the window, he saw her seated in the rocking chair with the child, already in its nightdress, sitting on her knee. The fair head with its wild, fierce hair was drooping towards the fire warmth, which reflected on the bright cheeks and clear skin of the child, who seemed to be musing, almost like a grown-up person. The mother's face was dark and still, and he saw, with a pang, that she was away back in the life that had been. The child's hair gleamed like spun glass. Her face was illuminated till it seemed like wax lit up from the inside. The wind boomed strongly. Mother and child sat motionless, silent. The child staring with vacant dark eyes into the fire, the mother looking into space. The little girl was almost asleep. It was her will which kept her eyes so wide. Suddenly, she looked round, troubled, as the wind shook the house, and Brangwen saw the small lips move. The mother began to rock. He heard the slight crunch of the rockers of the chair. Then he heard the low, monotonous murmur of a song in a foreign language. Then a great burst of wind. The mother seemed to have drifted away. The child's eyes were black and dilated. Brangwen looked up at the clouds which packed in great, alarming haste across the dark sky. Then there came the child's high, complaining, yet imperative voice. "Don't sing that stuff, Mother. I don't want to hear it." The singing died away. "You will go to bed," said the mother. He saw the clinging protest of the child, the unmoved farawayness of the mother, the clinging, grasping effort of a child. Then suddenly the clear childish challenge. "I want you to tell me a story." The wind blew. The story began. The child nestled against the mother. Brangwen waited outside, suspended, looking at the wild waving of the trees in the wind and the gathering darkness. He had his fate to follow. He lingered there at the threshold. The child crouched distinct and motionless, curled in against her mother, the eyes dark and unblinking among the keen wisps of hair, like a curled-up animal asleep, but for the eyes. The mother sat as if in shadow. The story went on as if by itself. Brangwen stood outside, seeing the night fall. He did not notice the passage of time. The hand that held the daffodils was fixed and cold. The story came to an end. The mother rose at last, with the child clinging round her neck. She must be strong, to carry so large a child so easily. The little Anna clung round her mother's neck. The fair, strange face of the child looked over the shoulder of the mother, all asleep but the eyes, and these, wide and dark, kept up the resistance and the fight with something unseen. When they were gone, Brangwen stirred for the first time from the place where he stood and looked round at the night. He wished it were really as beautiful and familiar as it seemed in these few moments of release. Along with the child, He felt a curious strain on him, a suffering like a fate. The mother came down again and began folding the child's clothes. He knocked. She opened, wondering, a little bit at bay, like a foreigner uneasy. "Good evening," he said. "I'll just come in a minute." A change went quickly over her face. She was unprepared. She looked down at him as he stood in the light from the window, holding the daffodils, the darkness behind. In his black clothes, she again did not know him. She was almost afraid. But he was already stepping onto the threshold and closing the door behind him. She turned into the kitchen, startled out of herself by this invasion from the night. He took off his hat and came towards her. Then he stood in the light, in his black clothes and his black stock, hat in one hand and yellow flowers in the other. She stood away, at his mercy, snatched out of herself. She did not know him. Only she knew he was a man come for her. She could only see the dark-clad man's figure standing there upon her, and the gripped fist of flowers. She could not see the face and the living eyes. He was watching her, without knowing her, only aware underneath of her presence. "I come to have a word with you," he said, striding forward to the table, laying down his hat and the flowers, which tumbled apart and lay in a loose heap. She had flinched from his advance. She had no will, no being. The wind boomed in the chimney, and he waited. He had disembarrassed his hands. Now he shut his fists. He was aware of her standing there unknown, dread, yet related to him. "I came up," he said, speaking curiously matter-of-fact and level, "to ask if you'd marry me. You are free, aren't you?" There was a long silence, whilst his blue eyes, strangely impersonal, looked into her eyes to seek an answer to the truth. He was looking for the truth out of her, and she, as if hypnotized, must answer at length. "Yes, I am free to marry." The expression of his eyes changed, became less impersonal, as if he were looking almost at her, for the truth of her. Steady and intent and eternal they were, as if they would never change. They seemed to fix and to resolve her. She quivered, feeling herself created, will-less, lapsing into him, into a common will with him. "You want me?" she said. A pallor came over his face. "Yes," he said. Still there was no response and silence. "No," she said, not of herself. "No, I don't know." He felt the tension breaking up in him. His fists slackened. He was unable to move. He stood there looking at her, helpless in his vague collapse. For the moment she had become unreal to him. Then he saw her come to him, curiously direct and as if without movement, in a sudden flow. She put her hand to his coat. "Yes, I want to," she said impersonally, looking at him with wide, candid, newly opened eyes, open now with supreme truth. He went very white as he stood and did not move. Only his eyes were held by hers, and he suffered. She seemed to see him with her newly opened, wide eyes, almost of a child, and with a strange movement that was agony to him. She reached slowly forward her dark face and her breast to him, with a slow insinuation of a kiss that made something break in his brain, and it was darkness over him for a few moments. He had her in his arms, and, obliterated, was kissing her, and it was sheer, bleached agony to him, to break away from himself. She was there so small and light and accepting in his arms, like a child, and yet with such an insinuation of embrace, of infinite embrace, that he could not bear it, he could not stand. He turned and looked for a chair, and keeping her still in his arms, sat down with her close to him, to his breast. Then, for a few seconds, he went utterly to sleep, asleep and sealed in the darkest sleep, utter, extreme oblivion, from which he came to gradually, always holding her warm and close upon him, and she as utterly silent as he, involved in the same oblivion, the fecund darkness. He returned gradually, but newly created, as after a gestation, a new birth, in the womb of darkness. Aerial and light, everything was new as a morning, fresh and newly begun. Like a dawn, the newness and the bliss filled in. And she sat utterly still with him, as if in the same. Then she looked up at him, the wide, young eyes blazing with light. And he bent down and kissed her on the lips. and the dawn blazed in them. Their new life came to pass. It was beyond all conceiving good. It was so good that it was almost like a passing away, a trespass. He drew her suddenly closer to him, for soon the light began to fade in her, gradually, and as she was in his arms, her head sank. She leaned it against him and lay still, with sunk head, a little tired, effaced because she was tired. And in her tiredness was a certain negation of him. "There is the child," she said, out of the long silence. He did not understand. It was a long time since he had heard a voice. Now also he heard the wind roaring, as if it had just begun again. "Yes," he said, not understanding. There was a slight contraction of pain at his heart, a slight tension on his brows. Something he wanted to grasp and could not. "You will love her?" she said. The quick contraction, like pain, went over him again. "I love her now," he said. She lay still against him, taking his physical warmth without heed. It was great confirmation for him to feel her there, absorbing the warmth from him, giving him back her weight and her strange confidence. But where was she, that she seemed so absent? His mind was open with wonder. He did not know her. "But I am much older than you," she said. "How old?" he asked. "I am 34, she said. "I am 28, he said. 6 years. She was oddly concerned, even as if it pleased her a little. He sat and listened and wondered. It was rather splendid to be so ignored by her, whilst she lay against him, and he lifted her with his breathing and felt her weight upon his living. So he had a completeness and an inviolable power. He did not interfere with her. He did not even know her. It was so strange that she lay there with her weight abandoned upon him. He was silent with delight. He felt strong, physically, carrying her on his breathing. The strange, inviolable completeness of the two of them made him feel as sure and as stable as God. Amused, he wondered what the vicar would say if he knew. "You needn't stop here much longer, housekeeping," he said. "I like it also here," she said. "When one has been in many places, it is very nice here." He was silent again at this. So close on him she lay, and yet she answered him from so far away. But he did not mind. "What was your own home like when you were little?" he asked. "My father was a landowner," she replied. "It was near a river." This did not convey much to him. All was as vague as before, but he did not care, whilst she was so close. "I am a landowner, a little one," he said. "Yes," she said. He had not dared to move. He sat there with his arms round her, her lying motionless on his breathing, and for a long time he did not stir. Then softly, timidly, his hand settled on the roundness of her arm, on the unknown. She seemed to lie a little closer. A hot flame licked up from his belly to his chest. But it was too soon. She rose and went across the room to a drawer, taking out a little tray cloth. There was something quiet and professional about her. She had been a nurse beside her husband, both in Warsaw and in the rebellion afterwards. She proceeded to set a tray. It was as if she ignored Brangwen. He sat up, unable to bear a contradiction in her. She moved about inscrutably. Then, as he sat there, all mused and wondering, she came near to him, looking at him with wide, gray eyes that almost smiled with a low light. But her ugly, beautiful mouth was still unmoved and sad. He was afraid. His eyes, strained and roused with amusedness, quailed a little before her. He felt himself quailing, and yet he rose, as if obedient to her. He bent and kissed her heavy, sad, wide mouth that was kissed and did not alter. Fear was too strong in him. Again, he had not got her. She turned away. The vicarage kitchen was untidy, and yet to him beautiful, with the untidiness of her and her child. Such a wonderful remoteness there was about her, and then something in touch with him that made his heart knock in his chest. He stood there and waited, suspended. Again she came to him, as he stood in his black clothes, with blue eyes very bright and puzzled for her, his face tensely alive, his hair disheveled. She came close up to him, to his intent, black-clothed body, and laid her hand on his arm. He remained unmoved. Her eyes, with a blackness of memory struggling with passion, primitive and electric away at the back of them, rejected him and absorbed him at once. But he remained himself. He breathed with difficulty, and sweat came out at the roots of his hair, on his forehead. "Do you want to marry me?" she asked slowly, always uncertain. He was afraid lest he could not speak. He drew breath hard, saying, "I do." Then again, what was agony to him? With one hand lightly resting on his arm, she leaned forward a little and with a strange, primeval suggestion of embrace, held him her mouth. It was ugly beautiful, and he could not bear it. He put his mouth on hers, and slowly, slowly the response came, gathering force and passion, till it seemed to him she was thundering at him till he could bear no more. He drew away, white, unbreathing. Only in his blue eyes was something of himself concentrated, and in her eyes was a little smile upon a black void. She was drifting away from him again, and he wanted to go away. It was intolerable. He could bear no more. He must go. Yet he was irresolute. But she turned away from him. With a little pang of anguish, of denial, it was decided. "I'll come and speak to the vicar tomorrow," he said, taking his hat. She looked at him, her eyes expressionless and full of darkness. He could see no answer. "That'll do, won't it?" he said. "Yes," she answered, mere echo without body or meaning.
"Good night," he said.
"Good night." He left her standing there, expressionless and void as she was. Then she went on laying the tray for the vicar. Kneading the table, she put the daffodils aside on the dresser without noticing them. Only their coolness, touching her hand, remained echoing there a long while. They were such strangers, they must forever be such strangers, that his passion was a clanging torment to him. Such intimacy of embrace, and such utter foreignness of contact. It was unbearable. He could not bear to be near her and know the utter foreignness between them, know how entirely they were strangers to each other. He went out into the wind. Big holes were blown into the sky. The moonlight blew about. Sometimes a high moon, liquid brilliant, scudded across a hollow space and took cover under electric, brown iridescent cloud edges. Then there was a blot of cloud and shadow. Then somewhere in the night a radiance again, like a vapor. And all the sky was teeming and tearing along, a vast disorder of flying shapes and darkness and ragged fumes of light, and a great brown circling halo, then the terror of a moon running liquid brilliant into the open for a moment, hurting the eyes before she plunged under cover of cloud again.
2.
They live at the marsh. She was the daughter of a Polish landowner who, deeply in debt to the Jews, had married a German wife with money and who had died just before the rebellion. Quite young, she had married Paul Lenski, an intellectual who had studied at Berlin and had returned to Warsaw a patriot. Her mother had married a German merchant and gone away. Lydia Lenski, married to the young doctor, became with him a patriot and an emancipee. They were poor, but they were very conceited. She learned nursing as a mark of her emancipation. They represented in Poland the new movement just begun in Russia. But they were very patriotic and, at the same time, very European. They had 2 children. Then came the Great Rebellion. Lenski, very ardent and full of words, went about inciting his countrymen. Little Poles flamed down the streets of Warsaw on the way to shoot every Muscovite. So they crossed into the south of Russia, and it was common for 6 little insurgents to ride into a Jewish village, brandishing swords and words, emphasizing the fact that they were going to shoot every living Muscovite. Lenski was something of a fire-eater also. Lydia, tempered by her German blood, coming of a different family, was obliterated, carried along in her husband's emphasis of declaration and his whirl of patriotism. He was indeed a brave man, but no bravery could quite have equaled the vividness of his talk. He worked very hard, till nothing lived in him but his eyes. And Lydia, as if drugged, followed him like a shadow, serving, echoing. Sometimes she had her 2 children, sometimes they were left behind. She returned once to find them both dead of diphtheria. Her husband wept aloud, unaware of everybody. But the war went on. and soon he was back at his work. A darkness had come over Lydia's mind. She walked always in a shadow, silenced, with a strange, deep terror having hold of her. Her desire was to seek satisfaction in dread, to enter a nunnery, to satisfy the instincts of dread in her through service of a dark religion. But she could not. Then came the flight to London. Lenski, the little, thin man, had got all his life locked into a resistance and could not relax again. He lived in a sort of insane irritability, touchy, haughty to the last degree, fractious, so that as assistant doctor in one of the hospitals he soon became impossible. They were almost beggars, but he kept still his great ideas of himself. He seemed to live in a complete hallucination, where he himself figured vivid and lordly. He guarded his wife jealously against the ignominy of her position, rushed round her like a brandished weapon, an amazing sight to the English eye, had her in his power, as if he hypnotized her. She was passive, dark, always in shadow. He was wasting away. Already when the child was born, he seemed nothing but skin and bone and fixed idea. She watched him dying, nursed the baby, but really took no notice of anything. A darkness was on her, like remorse, or like a remembering of the dark, savage, mystic ride of dread, of death, of the shadow of revenge. When her husband died, she was relieved. He would no longer dart about her. England fitted her mood, its aloofness and foreignness. She had known a little of the language before coming, and a sort of parrot mind made her pick it up fairly easily. But she knew nothing of the English, nor of English life. Indeed, these did not exist for her. She was like one walking in the underworld, where the shades throng intelligibly, but have no connection with one. She felt the English people as a potent, cold, slightly hostile host amongst whom she walked isolated. The English people themselves were almost deferential to her. The church saw that she did not want. She walked without passion, like a shade, tormented into moments of love by the child. Her dying husband, with his tortured eyes and the skin drawn tight over his face, he was as a vision to her, not a reality. In a vision, he was buried and put away. Then the vision ceased. She was untroubled. Time went on gray, uncolored, like a long journey where she sat unconscious as the landscape unrolled beside her. When she rocked her baby at evening, maybe she fell into a Polish slumber song, or she talked sometimes to herself in Polish. Otherwise, she did not think of Poland, nor of that life to which she had belonged. It was a great blot looming blank in its darkness. In the superficial activity of her life, she was all English. She even thought in English. But her long blanks and darknesses of abstraction were Polish.
So she lived for some time.
Then, with slight uneasiness, she used half to awake to the streets of London. She realized that there was something around her very foreign. She realized she was in a strange place. And then she was sent away into the country. There came into her mind now the memory of her home where she had been a child, the big house among the land, the peasants of the village. She was sent to Yorkshire to nurse an old rector in his rectory by the sea. This was the first shake of the kaleidoscope that brought in front of her eyes something she must see. It hurt her brain, the open country, and the moors. It hurt her and hurt her. Yet it forced itself upon her as something living. It roused some potency of her childhood in her. It had some relation to her. There was green and silver and blue in the air about her now. And there was a strange insistence of light from the sea, to which she must attend. Primroses glimmered around, many of them, and she stooped to the disturbing influence near her feet. She even picked one or two flowers, faintly remembering in the new color of life what had been. All the day long, as she sat at the upper window, the light came off the sea, constantly, without refusal, till it seemed to bear her away, and the noise of the sea created a drowsiness in her, a relaxation like sleep. Her automatic consciousness gave way a little. She stumbled sometimes. She had a poignant, momentary vision of her living child that hurt her unspeakably. Her soul roused to attention. Very strange was the constant glitter of the sea unsheathed in heaven. Very warm and sweet the graveyard, in a nook of the hill catching the sunshine and holding it as one holds a bee between the palms of the hands. when it is benumbed. Gray grass and lichens and a little church and snowdrops among coarse grass and a cupful of incredibly warm sunshine. She was troubled in spirit. Hearing the rushing of the beck away down under the trees, she was startled and wondered what it was. Walking down, she found the bluebells around her glowing like a presence among the trees. Summer came. The moors were tangled with harebells like water in the ruts of the roads. The heather came rosy under the skies, setting the whole world awake. And she was uneasy. She went past the gorse bushes shrinking from their presence. She stepped into the heather as into a quickening bath that almost hurt. Her fingers moved over the clasped fingers of the child. She heard the anxious voice of the baby as it tried to make her talk, distraught. And she shrank away again, back into her darkness, and for a long while remained blotted safely away from living. But autumn came with a faint red glimmer of robins singing, winter darkened the moors, and almost savagely she turned again to life, demanding her life back again, demanding that it should be as it had been when she was a girl, on the land at home, under the sky. Snow lay in great expanses. The telegraph posts strode over the white earth, away under the gloom of the sky. And savagely her desire rose in her again, demanding that this was Poland, her youth, that all was her own again. But there were no sledges nor bells. She did not see the peasants coming out like new people, in their sheepskins and their fresh, ruddy, bright faces that seemed to become new and vivid when the snow lit up the ground. It did not come to her, the life of her youth. It did not come back. There was a little agony of struggle, then a relapse into the darkness of the convent, where Satan and the devils raged round the walls, and Christ was white on the cross of victory. She watched from the sick room the snow whirl past, like flocks of shadows in haste, flying on some final mission out to a leaden inalterable sea, beyond the final whiteness of the curving shore and the snow-speckled blackness of the rocks half submerged. But near at hand on the trees the snow was soft in bloom. Only the voice of the dying vicar spoke gray and querulous from behind. By the time the snowdrops were out, however, he was dead. He was dead. But with curious equanimity, the returning woman watched the snowdrops on the edge of the grass below, blown white in the wind, but not to be blown away. She watched them fluttering and bobbing, the white, shut flowers anchored by a thread to the gray-green grass, yet never blown away, not drifting with the wind. As she rose in the morning, the dawn was beating up white, gusts of light blown like a thin snowstorm from the east, blown stronger and fiercer, till the rose appeared, and the gold, and the sea lit up below. She was impassive and indifferent, yet she was outside the enclosure of darkness. There passed a space of shadow again, the familiarity of dread worship, during which she was moved, oblivious, to Kossuth. There, at first, there was nothing, just gray nothing. But then one morning there was a light from the yellow jasmine caught her, and after that, morning and evening, the persistent ringing of thrushes from the shrubbery, till her heart, beaten upon, was forced to lift up its voice in rivalry and answer. Little tunes came into her mind. She was full of trouble, almost like anguish, resistant. She knew she was beaten, and from fear of darkness turned to fear of light. She would have hidden herself indoors if she could. Above all, she craved for the peace and heavy oblivion of her old state. She could not bear to come to realize. The first pangs of this new parturition were so acute, she knew she could not bear it. She would rather remain out of life than be torn, mutilated into this birth, which she could not survive. She had not the strength to come to life now. In England, so foreign, skies so hostile. She knew she would die like an early, colorless, scentless flower that the end of the winter puts forth mercilessly. And she wanted to harbor her modicum of twinkling life. But a sunshiny day came full of the scent of a Miserian tree, when bees were tumbling into the yellow crocuses, and she forgot. She felt like somebody else, not herself, a new person, quite glad. But she knew it was fragile, and she dreaded it. The vicar put pea flour into the crocuses for his bees to roll in, and she laughed. Then night came, with brilliant stars that she knew of old, from her girlhood. And they flashed so bright, She knew they were victors. She could neither wake nor sleep, as if crushed between the past and the future, like a flower that comes above ground to find a great stone lying above it. She was helpless. The bewilderment and helplessness continued. She was surrounded by great moving masses that must crush her, and there was no escape, save in the old obliviousness, the cold darkness she strove to retain. But the vicar showed her eggs in the thrush's nest near the back door. She saw herself the mother thrush upon the nest, and the way her wings were spread, so eager down upon her secret. The tense, eager, nesting wings moved her beyond endurance. She thought of them in the morning, when she heard the thrush whistling as he got up, and she thought, "Why didn't I die out there? Why am I brought here?" She was aware of people who passed around her, not as persons, but as looming presences. It was very difficult for her to adjust herself. In Poland, the peasantry, the people, had been cattle to her. They had been her cattle that she owned and used. What were these people? Now she was coming awake. She was lost. But she had felt Brangwen go by almost as if he had brushed her. She had tingled in body as she had gone on up the road. After she had been with him in the marsh kitchen, the voice of her body had risen strong and insistent. Soon she wanted him. He was the man who had come nearest to her for her awakening. Always, however, between whiles she lapsed into the old unconsciousness, indifference, and there was a will in her to save herself from living any more. But she would wake in the morning one day and feel her blood running, feel herself lying open like a flower unsheathed in the sun, insistent and potent with demand. She got to know him better, and her instinct fixed on him, just on him. Her impulse was strong against him, because he was not of her own sort. But one blind instinct led her to take him, to leave him, and then to relinquish herself to him. It would be safety. She felt the rooted safety of him and the life in him. Also, he was young and very fresh. The blue, steady livingness of his eyes she enjoyed like morning. He was very young. Then she lapsed again to stupor and indifference. This, however, was bound to pass. The warmth flowed through her. She felt herself opening, unfolding, asking, as a flower opens in full request under the sun, as the beaks of tiny birds open flat, to receive, to receive. And unfolded she turned to him, straight to him, and he came, slowly, afraid, held back by uncouth fear, and driven by a desire bigger than himself. When she opened and turned to him, then all that had been and all that was gone from her. She was as new as a flower that unsheathes itself and stands always ready, waiting, receptive. He could not understand this. He forced himself, through lack of understanding, to the adherence to the line of honorable courtship and sanctioned, licensed marriage. Therefore, after he had gone to the vicarage and asked for her, she remained for some days held in this one spell, open, receptive to him, before him. He was roused to chaos. He spoke to the vicar and gave in the banns. Then he stood to wait. She remained attentive and instinctively expectant before him, unfolded, ready to receive him. He could not act because of self-fear and because of his conception of honor toward her. So he remained in a state of chaos. And after a few days, gradually she closed again, away from him, was sheathed over, impervious to him, oblivious. Then a black, bottomless despair became real to him. He knew what he had lost. He felt he had lost it for good. He knew what it was to have been in communication with her, and to be cast off again. In misery, his heart like a heavy stone, he went about unliving, till gradually he became desperate, lost his understanding, was plunged in a revolt that knew no bounds. Inarticulate, he moved with her at the marsh in violent, gloomy, wordless passion, almost in hatred of her, till gradually she became aware of him, aware of herself with regard to him. Her blood stirred to life. She began to open towards him, to flow towards him again. He waited till the spell was between them again, till they were together within one rushing, hastening flame. And then again he was bewildered. He was tied up as with cords and could not move to her. So she came to him and unfastened the breast of his waistcoat and his shirt and put her hand on him, needing to know him. for it was cruel to her to be opened and offered to him, yet not to know what he was, not even that he was there. She gave herself to the hour, but he could not, and he bungled in taking her, so that he lived in suspense, as if only half his faculties worked until the wedding. She did not understand, but the vagueness came over her again, and the days lapsed by. He could not get definitely into touch with her. For the time being, she let him go again. He suffered very much from the thought of actual marriage, the intimacy and nakedness of marriage. He knew her so little. They were so foreign to each other. They were such strangers, and they could not talk to each other. When she talked of Poland or of what had been, it was all so foreign. She scarcely communicated anything to him. And when he looked at her, an overmuch reverence and fear of the unknown changed the nature of his desire into a sort of worship, holding her aloof from his physical desire, self-thwarting. She did not know this. She did not understand. They had looked at each other and had accepted each other. It was so, then there was nothing to balk at. It was complete between them. At the wedding, his face was stiff and expressionless. He wanted a drink, to get rid of his forethought and afterthought, to set the moment free. But he could not. The suspense only tightened at his heart. The jesting and joviality and jolly, broad insinuation of the guests only coiled him more. He could not hear. That which was impending obsessed him. He could not get free. She sat quiet, with a strange, still smile. She was not afraid. Having accepted him, she wanted to take him. She belonged altogether to the hour, now. No future, no past, only this her hour. She did not even notice him, as she sat beside him at the head of the table. He was very near, their coming together was close at hand. What more? As the time came for all the guests to go, her dark face was softly lighted. The bend of her head was proud, her gray eyes clear and dilated, so that the men could not look at her, and the women were elated by her. They served her. Very wonderful she was, as she bade farewell, her ugly wide mouth smiling with pride and recognition, her voice speaking softly and richly in the foreign accent, her dilated eyes ignoring one and all the departing guests. Her manner was gracious and fascinating, but she ignored the being of him or her to whom she gave her hand. And Brangwen stood beside her, giving his hearty handshake to his friends, receiving their regard gratefully, glad of their attention. His heart was tormented within him. He did not try to smile. The time of his trial and his admittance, his Gethsemane and his triumphal entry in one, had come now. Behind her, there was so much unknown to him. When he approached her, he came to such a terrible, painful unknown. How could he embrace it and fathom it? How could he close his arms round all this darkness and hold it to his breast and give himself to it? What might not happen to him? If he stretched and strained forever, he would never be able to grasp it all, and to yield himself naked out of his own hands into the unknown power. How could a man be strong enough to take her, put his arms round her and have her, and be sure he could conquer this awful unknown next his heart? What was it then that she was, to which he must also deliver himself up, and which at the same time he must embrace, contain? He was to be her husband. It was established so. And he wanted it more than he wanted life, or anything. She stood beside him in her silk dress, looking at him strangely, so that a certain horror took possession of him, because she was strange and impending and he had no choice. He could not bear to meet her look from under her strange, thick brows. "Is it late?" she said. He looked at his watch. "No, 11:30, he said. And he made an excuse to go into the kitchen, leaving her standing in the room among the disorder and the drinking glasses. Tilly was seated beside the fire in the kitchen, her head in her hands. She started up when he entered. "Why haven't you gone to bed?" he said. "I thought I'd better stop and lock up and do," she said. Her agitation quietened him. He gave her some little order, then returned, steadied now, almost ashamed, to his wife. She stood a moment watching him, as he moved with averted face. Then she said, "You will be good to me, won't you?" She was small and girlish and terrible, with a queer, wide look in her eyes. His heart leaped in him, in anguish of love and desire. He went blindly to her and took her in his arms. "I want to," he said as he drew her closer and closer in. She was soothed by the stress of his embrace and remained quite still, relaxed against him, mingling into him. And he let himself go from past and future, was reduced to the moment with her, in which he took her and was with her, and there was nothing beyond. They were together in an elemental embrace beyond their superficial foreignness.